In the summer of 1969, the Australian 6 RAR was engaged with the NVA 33rd Regiment, about 10 to 12 kilometers north of Binh Ba. They had requested a tank recovery vehicle, which had left the Nui Dat base on the morning of 6 June 1969, escorted by one Centurion tank. Although the route north from the base was considered relatively safe, there was still the possibility of enemy activity. At about 0800 hours on the 6th of June, as the tank and the recovery vehicle were in the area of the village of Binh Ba, the Centurion tank was hit by an enemy RPG round, wounding the turret operator. The Australian crews immediately engaged with machine gun fire from both vehicles before they left the scene and called the base for reinforcements. After the Centurion tank was hit, 2 regional force platoons were sent to investigate, but were stopped by heavy fire from the village. The district chief requested support from provincial headquarters in Bahria, which in turn requested assistance from the more lethal Australian Army forces. Less than an hour later, Major Murray Blake attended a briefing at the task force headquarters. Blake was the officer commanding the task force's Ready Reaction Force, D Company, 5 RAR. At about 1000 hours, Blake's company left Nui Dat in Armored Personnel Carriers, or APCs, commanded by Captain Ray DeVere of B Squadron, 3 Cavalry Regiment. With them was a composite group of tanks from B Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Brian Sullivan. While the Australians traveled the short distance between Nui Dat and Binh Ba, the local district chief tried to evacuate the civilian population. He also deployed his own troops, members of the regional force, into blocking positions to cut off the enemy's escape. Half an hour after leaving Nui Dat, Blake's force deployed about 300 meters to the southeast of Binh Ba and awaited clearance to move in. Sergeant Brian London, 10 Platoon's acting commander, remembered pulling up on open ground before the village. Seconds later, RPG smoke trails headed towards him. Instinct demanded that he exit the APC. A hit from the RPG could have killed or wounded everyone on board, but he fought the urge and stayed. The armored vehicles were just outside effective RPG range, and their crews were already returning fire. The Battle of Binh Ba was underway. Blake, DeVere, and Sullivan decided on an armored assault, believing that the dismounted infantry would be too vulnerable to enemy fire. DeVere, the senior armored officer, took command during this phase of the operation. Approaching from the east, the Australians advanced with tanks in the center of the formation and the APCs on either side and to the rear. 2 tanks left in pursuit of enemy troops moving through the nearby rubber plantation, as reported by the pilot of an observation plane. One of the tanks was hit by 2 RPG rounds, wounding 3 of the crew. The gunner, unable to traverse his turret, kept up a steady fire against the enemy whenever they crossed his line of sight. Still believing that they were facing just 2 Viet Cong platoons, the rest of the Australians continued into the middle of Binh Ba, now with just 2 tanks in support. In the village center, the Australians came under a storm of fire. Murray Blake remembered seeing enemy everywhere, among them a heavy machine gun crew wheeling their weapon into position before they were killed by fire from DeVere's APC. This was no pair of Viet Cong platoons. The Australians had come up against NVA troops, a far stronger force than they had expected to meet. The tanks, meanwhile, were running low on ammunition. The Australians needed to extricate themselves from the village. Overhead, a helicopter gunship had arrived on the scene and fired rockets into the enemy-occupied houses. From above, the pilots could see tanks and APCs firing into the buildings, while enemy troops ran between buildings. 2 more Hueys were called in, and guided by DeVere's directions, began to attack positions on Binh Ba's southern side. Coming in low over the tanks, they fired their rockets and miniguns into the enemy, clearing the way for the armored units and the infantry of D Company to make their way out. By now, every tank had sustained some damage by enemy fire. One was so severely damaged that it was useless for further action. Sullivan, like the others, had been so heavily engaged that his tank left Binh Ba with its last round loaded. The decision was made to get the tanks out of the village to regroup. Once the tanks were safely on open ground away from the village, 9 Squadron RAAF helicopters flew in replacement crewmen, evacuated the wounded, including Sullivan, and delivered fresh ammunition. The battle was far from over. D Company, having broken out of the village, lined up for a second assault, this time from the west and supported by fresh tanks from 4th Troop B Squadron. As 1200 hours approached, B Company 5 RAR was dispatched to help D Company, at which point Lieutenant Colonel Kahn took command of Operation Hammer, relieving 6 RAR's Lieutenant Colonel David Butler. When they reached Binh Ba, B Company established blocking positions to the south and watched as flames rose from the buildings, marking the most intense combat scene. They then moved to the rubber plantation to block the east Supported by the APCs and tanks, the dismounted assault force, now back under Blake's command, divided into house-clearing teams of 2 to 3 men and advanced on the village. Fire from the first row of buildings in the village hit Private Wayne Teeling in the neck. Climbing up to the hatch of a nearby tank, Brian London had the crew commander fire a high-explosive round into the building from which the fatal shot had come. Inside the ruins, the Australians found the bodies of 6 enemy soldiers. By the evening of 6 June, the fighting had died down. An exhausted D Company and Armored Corps personnel took up a defensive position for the night. Binh Ba, however, was still not secure. All was quiet until about 0320 hours on 7 June when an Australian platoon killed 2 enemy troops as they tried to escape to the south. At 0700 hours, a company of MVA soldiers was seen heading towards Binh Ba. The Australians' B Company immediately opened with heavy fire, forcing the enemy to scatter and flee. When the Australians swept the area, they found an enemy body and several blood trails, indicating that at least 6 more enemies had been wounded. An hour later, a section of APCs traveling north towards Duc Trong came under RPG fire, and a large group of enemy troops were seen moving between houses. The 5 RAR Assault Pioneer Platoon, although readied for action, were not needed in the hamlet and moved to form a blocking force to Binh Ba's northeast. Local regional troops were then sent to Duc Trong and found the NVA had gone. Just before 1000 hours, the Australians' D Company, along with the tanks and APCs, lined up for another sweep of Binh Ba. They had to ensure that no NVA or Viet Cong had infiltrated the village during the night. By 1200 hours, the western half of the village was clear, and the search was then handed over to the Popular Force troops, who swept the eastern half of the village. A few hours later, the men who had fought the battle returned to Nui Dat. Casualty figures vary, but it seems that more than 100 VC and NVA lost their lives in this battle. Several South Vietnamese soldiers were also killed in the fighting. The Australians lost only 1 soldier, Private Teeling. The Australian forces would continue to dominate the area from their Nui Dat base, conducting many more operations throughout the rest of the war. The Battle of Binh Ba was just one more example of the bravery of the Australian forces and the decisive leadership that they had. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and watch additional videos. Thank you again. Catch you next time.